And I said, well, what does your gut say right now? Well, what does your heart say right now? What do you feel about this right now? She says, I've just got to do it. I don't think if I was listening just to her words, but the fact that she used words like feel regularly, she would have been able to make that breakthrough.
Hi everyone, my name is Marcel van der Hoef and you're listening to Meeting Strategist. On this podcast, I interview professionals and thinkers from all walks of life to learn more about their approach to meetings and extract tips, strategies, and ideas to help you get more out of meetings. You can learn more and stay up to date at meetingstrategist.org. For this conversation, I tried to listen even more deeply than I usually do, because today's guest is Oscar Trimboli, an executive coach, speaker, author, and listening expert based in Sydney, Australia. I got to know Oscar through his excellent podcast, Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, on which he interviews journalists, actors, professors, judges, and many others about their sometimes contrasting perspectives on listening. Before he started his coaching practice in 2013, Oscar spent more than 30 years in general management, sales and marketing roles at technology companies including Microsoft and Vodafone. To me, Oscar is a true role model for listening. You don't only notice that in the way he listens, but also, and maybe even more so, in how he talks. Oscar is one of those few people who seems to be extremely comfortable with silence. I shortened some of his longer pauses, but still, there's more silence in this episode than most of us are used to and comfortable with in our busy lives. At the risk of sounding corny, I'd like to conclude this intro by citing the titles of two of my favorite songs, because in combination, they very much apply to Oscar. Enjoy the silence and let it be. Thanks for joining me. I love your podcast, Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words. And I want to start by listening to your chosen title. What does this mean for you, Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words?
Well, for a lot of people, listening is simply a process of waiting for the other person to stop talking so they can get their point across. So deep listening is the ability to wait completely till the other person's finished speaking. It's the ability to notice the 125 rule, which says you speak at 125 words a minute, and yet you can listen to 400 words a minute, and you can think at up to 900 words a minute. So the likelihood that the person speaking is going to be able to say something that's really elegant, articulate, and well polished the first time they say that, it's about a 1 in 9 chance that they're going to say what they actually mean. So a deep listener is more comfortable to ask questions that helps the other person think rather than advocate their own position. Because a lot of times the act of listening is about your willingness to change. It's your willingness to change your own perspective rather than to change the perspective of the person speaking. So deep listening in my country, in Australia, our Indigenous people have a term, it's called Dadiri. And our Indigenous people explain that Dadiri is your ability to listen to yourself, to listen to the lands and to listen to the people who inhabit those lands, both those from the past, the present and the future. And these concepts are not unique to the Indigenous peoples of Australia. In China, they have a character called Ting. Ting is a 5-dimensional character. Ting means to listen in Chinese, but only 2 elements of Ting are physical, meaning to hear and to see. The other 3 elements of Ting are to focus, to feel, and to respect. So deep listening is your ability to listen at all those 5 levels and to be willing to feel, focus, and make sure that you respect.
And what's the benefit of that?
Well, for a lot of us, the benefit is often the cost that we see when it's not present. We go back a couple of weeks to see Serena Williams in the US Open tennis, not listening to the chair umpire and the chair umpire not listening to Serena Williams, and they were both right and they were both wrong. But it cost Serena Williams not only a Grand Slam tournament, but it also cost her the record of Grand Slam tournaments. The cost to Lego, for example, when they didn't listen to their customers, they didn't listen to their fans, they nearly went broke in early 2000. But the opposite is true too. The benefit for Lego when they started listening to their fans was they created a movie franchise, and they created a computer games franchise, all because they took the time to listen to what the fans were actually saying. So for us at home, it's broken relationships, whether it's with our spouse or our children or our parents or our siblings. In the workplace, it's repeating ourselves, sending emails after meetings because you didn't think you were heard properly. In projects, it's projects that run behind schedule or don't deliver the outcomes that people want. And in politics, it means that if the Democrats in the last US election didn't listen to their heartland voters, somebody who did got their vote. And Donald Trump became the president of the United States because he listened to the parts of the Democratic base that was taken for granted. And the same thing happened in the UK with Brexit. People weren't listening to older voters. People weren't listening to people who were marginalised in society without jobs. And as a result, Brexit's now taking place in the UK. So you don't have to look too far to see the cost of not listening. But because we're not taught how to do it, we don't always recognise the cost as a cost of not listening.
You bring up an interesting example with Lego. I'm currently reading Martin Lindstrom's book about small data. What do you think is the impact of big data on listening in decision making?
There's a marvellous book that I encourage everyone to read by Kath O'Neill, an academic from the United States, but used to be a quant analyst for Lehman Brothers in the late, I think it was late 2007, early 2008. And she's now an academic talking about the ethics of big data and how they're changing democracy. For most people in organizations, big data already exists. They're just not doing anything with it. Some of the big data often in organizations is the complaints that they receive from their customers, but rarely do they act on it. So big data gives humans the capacity to listen at a scale they've never listened before. But listening is two parts, hearing and acting. And too much of the big data conversation is about the collection rather than the action. So collecting all this information now, it has never been easier. I've collected 1,462 participants into a group for my listening research. And that means I can hear what people say, but what they're really interested in is what I do with that information and the results that come from the survey. So I think a lot of people get excited. I think a lot of people get fixated, and I think a lot of people get seduced by big data. As it's relating to listening, the question I always ask them is, collecting is the easy bit. You can put a microphone in the middle of a city town hall and listen to all sorts of things going on, but what can you actually do with it? So the second half of listening is action, and that's the bit I had to focus on with my research.
I want to take a step back to the impact beyond words bit in the title of your podcast, listening to the unsaid. To me, it seems that requires interpretation. And I'm, myself trained in the Socratic dialogue, and any form of interpretation there is assumption, and that belongs to you and not to the speaker. So that's not good listening in that field. What's your view on that?
Well, I think the simplest thing to do is just to say, look, the 5 levels of listening that I discuss are listening to yourself first, not the speaker, listening to the content from the speaker, listening to the context from the speaker, helping the listener to explore what they haven't said, what's unsaid, and then ultimately listening for meaning. Those last two levels are really all created by the speaker. The listener's role is limited to helping them explore what's unsaid with questions. As true as it is that the listener has assumptions, the speaker also has assumptions. The speaker has patterns about how they describe the world. They might describe the world as pictures, or they might describe the world as numbers or facts or figures. They might describe the world as a series of organic connected systems, or they might describe it as a disjointed set of random events that come together. And it's listening at these levels that much greater nuance beyond the words comes into being. I was facilitating a meeting with a leadership team about 2 years ago. It was quite a cold day. It was the middle of winter, and we were huddled up at a location that was fairly open near the sea in Sydney, in Australia. And by the morning tea break, everyone was quite feeling the cold. Now, the trouble is, in our country, our buildings are built for the heat, not the cold. So there's lots of glass and lots of open windows, and we want to make sure we get as much of the outside in. Whereas in the Northern Hemisphere, it's exactly the opposite. Yeah. But we're doing an exercise with the team in this meeting. And we're going around the table where I asked the team to describe what kind of animal this organization was. And each member of the team described the animal either as an eagle or an osprey, some bird of prey, or some elegant bird that flies in the air. It can move through 3 dimensions, and it can do anything it likes. It's fast, it's patient, it's exact. And there was one person in the room who hadn't spoken, Elaine. And we'd finished the exercise and the group had almost moved the conversation forward. But I paused in that moment and I just said to Elaine, I noticed you haven't described an animal yet. And there was a long pause and she said, well, my animal's completely different. To me, it seems very obvious that our organisation is really a snake. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, everybody's eyes turned to Ellen because there was this huge difference. Everybody described birds and speed and elegance, and all of a sudden, she described them as a snake. So I said to her, well, what are the characteristics of the snake that you feel represent this organisation? And she looked to the group and said, isn't it obvious? We're in the technology industry. Our industry changes very fast every year. And a snake needs to shed its skin every season to evolve to the next season. And it's in our shedding of our skin that we adapt and evolve into what the next season needs from us. We are a snake. Certainly we are a snake because we've been so successful in adapting. Now, for most people listening to that, describing a snake would have been negative. Mm-hmm. Describing a snake would have been considered maybe evil or sneaky or not truthful. But it was in her explanation of that the group went, yes, we are, and embraced what's good about the snake. And as a result, that became their mascot, and it became part of their story about how they told their customers and the prospective customers that they will shed their skin regularly to adapt to the changes in the industry. Yet if we didn't come back to listen to what was unsaid with Ellen in that moment, the reality is it would have been quite simple for the group to follow the obvious what was said mm-hmm. and think that we're all eagles, which the rest of the industry thought they were eagles as well. But it was this ability to adapt that set this company apart and enjoying really good growth as a result. But it's that pause, It's that moment in a meeting where you can look at somebody who hasn't spoken and just gently encourage them to offer their opinion. Because in too many meetings, we just move past that point because we have to finish the meeting. And the meeting's only got a set amount of time and we have an agenda. But for this company, they would have missed a massive opportunity to express what's great about them, to express what's different about them, if they didn't listen to this introverted lady who was a deep thinker. And there are many, many, many examples like that. Dr. Bronwyn King, she's done quite a famous TED Talk. She's a cancer oncology doctor. She specializes in lung cancer, and she sees a lot of people at the end of their life who started smoking when they were teenagers. And she had a situation where a decade into her career, she was able to afford putting a deposit on a home. And what she did was speak to her pension fund to understand if she had enough life insurance to cover her mortgage payments in case she passed away, and also if she had enough income protection insurance. And when she met the representative of the health industry pension fund, she was told she had enough money if she was to pass away or her husband to pass away. And she asked the representative, is there anything else I need to do? And they said, no, you don't have to worry. You're in the default option. It means she didn't have to announce her investment intentions. The company would do that for her, the pension fund. So she stepped away from the coffee she was having with that person. But something in her mind paused. She turned back and said, is there anything else I need to do? And the representative said, no, you're in the default option. And she kept walking on for another couple of paces and turned back and said, default option? Do I have an option? And he said, oh yeah, if you're a greenie, our greenies like the other options. And she said, oh, what are the other options? And there are people who don't want their pension fund investing in mining, alcohol, tobacco, or gambling. And she said, did you say tobacco? And he said, yes. And she says, do you know what I do? She says, look, I'm a lung cancer oncologist. That means I catch people at the end of their life who are the result of tobacco. Now, the obvious thing for her to do at that point in time was to switch. But she didn't do that. What she decided to do was speak to all the trustees of the Health Industry Superannuation Fund or the Health Industry Pension Fund and ask them why the default fund for a healthcare professional is invested in tobacco. She went very curious, and they explained that in the International Fund, there's Philip Morris, Imperial Tobacco, British and American Tobacco, and even Swedish match companies in that portfolio as well. And she said, in good conscience, can you be the trustees of the Health Industry Superannuation Fund and invest in tobacco? And they said, no, we can't. It took another 6 months to change the default. But what Dr. King has done since 2011, when she had that conversation, to 2018, she has spoken to AXA. She has spoken to many sovereign wealth funds in Europe, such as Norway, such as Sweden, such as Saudi Arabia, the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund, the largest pension fund in Canada, the California Teachers Pension Fund, the largest pension fund in California and the United States. And she, in that period of time from 2011 to 2018, has helped trustees divest $8 billion worth of tobacco stocks. She's got a long way to go. The market cap is $168 billion. But here's the thing. If she didn't listen to the word default option and something went, that jargon doesn't make sense for me. A lot of us listen to jargon from people who sell us products we don't really understand, and we accept that they're right. But in her case, her heart and her head weren't connected. Her gut was telling her the default and option don't go together, and she took a completely different path. The largest growth markets for tobacco in the world are Africa and Asia, not the West. And what Dr. King has brought to everyone's attention is 100,000 people a week globally die from tobacco-related illness. That's a very big stadium full of people. Now, if we have a bad car accident in a central location in a big city, it'll be on the news. But I'm not sure the last time anybody watched the news, listened to the radio, or picked up a newspaper, or saw something on the internet that said 100,000 people died this week of tobacco-related illness. And if you do the maths and figure out what that is annually, that's an enormous number of people. And rather than taking on the tobacco lobby the way traditional sources have been taking it on and trying to dampen demand, Dr. King, by listening to the words default option, is now working with trustees to get them to sell down their tobacco stocks so the next generation of kids in Africa and Asia don't have to smoke because it's just not available. So some of us every day hear words like default option and this kind of jargon, and we're just so robotic that we're not listening, that we miss out on these big opportunities and big opportunities to have impacts beyond words.
I think it's interesting that Dr. King, being a lung cancer oncologist, and then going to speak with the trustees of these funds that are investing in tobacco companies, she must have a lot of prejudice about those funds and why they are making these investments, knowing what these companies are doing. That makes it really hard to listen and to be genuinely curious in what, their rationale is.
Yeah, and Marcel, I think when you use the word curiosity, this is one of the things Dr. King is amazing at. She realized she had no expertise in finance. She realized she had no expertise in fund management, asset allocation. She had no expertise in fiduciary duty. She had no expertise in return on investment, portfolio analysis, and whatever other language might be used as it relates to fund management. But what she did was just be curious in the kinds of questions she asked, and more importantly, how she went about asking these questions. When you hear Dr. King talk about this, she explains that the majority of people she'll be seeing are men. The majority of people she sees who in these roles as trustees are usually over 55 or 60, and they always have grandchildren. So she always starts by, could you explain to me how you arrived at the decision to make these investments as if I was your grandchild? Now, this is a very powerful reframe because the language needs to be simplified, but it also gets the trustee thinking about the generation ahead. And Dr. King said by framing her questions through this, the language was free of jargon. It was much simpler, but it also helped connect the trustee to the emotional elements of a very rational profession. You've interviewed a lot of fund managers, and you know that they're very numerate, they're very rational. They make decisions based on whether this is making money for me or not. Otherwise, people are going to take money out of my fund.
Yeah.
But in asking these questions in a way that could be simplified, Bronwyn King started to get educated by these fund managers, and she started to learn their language. And more importantly, in asking these questions in a very simple way, she gained their trust. She gained their trust because she was talking to their heart and not their head, and started creating an army of people who started referring her to other fund managers around the world. It's a very connected and global profession. These people know each other very well. They speak to each other very often, and they're very connected, and they're very interconnected. And as a result of her putting aside her prejudices, she was very frustrated initially, particularly when she spoke to the first set of trustees, because they were in a health industry superannuation pension fund. They weren't in a general fund. They were looking after nurses and doctors, and to have tobacco in those portfolios was a complete oversight. And she treated it as an education issue rather than an issue around whether they were right or wrong. She felt if she could educate them, then she could be successful in generating change, rather than trying to be frustrated or berating them for not seeing what seemed logical to her but wasn't necessarily logical to them, because they were being compensated on the best returns.
How did she prepare for these meetings with the trustees in a way that she was really able to listen and not, listen to her self-talk, to her anger about this issue, but, really listen?
She was really connected with the more significant purpose of what she was doing. She's one of these great leaders who realizes it's not about her, it's about the impact she needs to create. It's for the generations in the future who don't have to see a lung cancer oncologist. It's for the generations in Africa and Asia who don't have to smoke and have all these other diseases come around them. It's her ability to almost detach herself from her role in it and understand that she needs to carry the result for everybody who was a patient she treated, whether they lived or not, but more importantly for their families. She keeps saying 100,000 people a week. Where is that headline in the newspaper? And the reality is many people have tried to take on the tobacco industry through very traditional methods, and she realized she had to pretty much stay out of sight and working in the background. And yet in doing so, she's had a really significant impact because she's detached herself from what she feels about it and understands she's got $160 billion to go, and that's not going to happen in her lifetime. She's created an organization called Tobacco Free Portfolios so that people can choose a tobacco-free portfolio when they invest, whether that's in their pension fund or any other fund. If you're invested in an index fund, as an example, there's probably a good chance you're invested in tobacco.
It's a fascinating case, because what I also hear is the impact of power dynamics on listening ability. As you say, like, she was not trained in financial affairs, but still she went to those trustees of these funds and exposed herself to their lingo and their environment and their expert power. What do you think is the influence of power dynamics on listening?
So listening is situational, it's relational, and it's contextual. So you will listen to your manager differently than you'll listen to a coworker. You'll listen differently to your parents than you will to your children. You'll listen differently to your brother or your sister than you would a friend. And if you hold that in the workplace as an example, these power dynamics completely overlay when it comes to listening. People will always listen to their superiors in a much deeper way, with fewer distractions than they will to others. And one of the things that leaders need to role model for their teams is the simple act of listening. I remember I had a visiting exec from Microsoft headquarters in 2012. And his name was Peter, and he was fascinating to me as a role model for listening. He had a typical schedule where he would pretty much come off the plane, go into meetings from 8 a.m. in the morning to 8 p.m. at night, concluding with a customer dinner. And in most cases, they probably don't even schedule bathroom breaks for these people. They're quite busy. Well, what Peter did was fascinating to me. I was hosting him in Australia, and the first meeting he sat down with some internal employees. He opened up his bag, took out a pen and a piece of paper, and announced to the group that he is shutting off his phone, not to vibrate, but shutting it off completely and putting it in his bag, because this is the most important thing he needs to do for the next 35 minutes, was to listen to this group of employees. He didn't have a laptop out. He didn't have any kind of tablet. He didn't have any digital pen, although he worked in a company that probably sold lots of them. He took out pen and a piece of paper. And that very act of him saying that, laptop lids went down in the meeting. Sheepishly, some mobile phones were switched to vibrate mode or put in pockets. But I've never seen a group of people paying enormous amount of listening attention to each other as I saw in that 35-minute meeting. And the reason I know it's 35 minutes is because the meeting was scheduled for 50. But because the quality of the conversation was so high, the meeting concluded much more quickly. And it concluded in a way that very few leaders do to show that they're listening. Peter summarized from his workbook what he heard in the meeting and what he would do about it. This is rare in my experience and in my consulting work, because a lot of meetings, people generally turn up late, generally have a laptop, an iPad, a mobile phone with them, and meetings are completely distracted. So in terms of power dynamics, I think leaders have an enormous role to play in helping those that they work with to understand what listening actually looks like. A lot of leaders go on listening tours when they're appointed into their roles, but very, very few people actually take the time to explain to the people in the room what notes they've taken, and even fewer people explain what they're going to do about it. So I guess in terms of power dynamics, people do listen completely differently. If the president or the prime minister is in the room, people will listen differently to if the janitor's in the room. And it's a shame, because we all miss out by not listening.
If you look at expert, powerful people, like doctors, for example, what do you think these powerful people can do so they create a better environment for listening?
Doctors are a great example. Dr. Danielle Offrey has written a brilliant book called What Doctors Say and What Patients Hear. And in that book, she talks about a study that was done in North America. The time between the time the doctor asks the patient what brought them here today and the time the doctor will interrupt them is a very short period of time. When I ask groups, how long between the time you walk into the doctor's from the doctor's waiting room into the doctor's room, do they start diagnosing your problem? And most people will say 90 seconds or maybe 2 minutes. But in North America, where it's a very monetary-based incentive system for physicians, the average, so this is not the shortest, the average time between the time the patient sits down and the doctor starts to prescribe a diagnosis is 18 seconds. 18 seconds. That's about 6 to 7 words that most people can say. 18 seconds. And yet the doctors who are sued the most for malpractice, tend to interrupt at the shorter end of the spectrum, and the doctors who have the least malpractice have 2 to 3 minutes between the time they ask the patient and then they offer a diagnosis. So the expert relationship is fascinating there. So your question was, what can the expert do to create an environment that encourages listening?
Mm.
And in Dr. Ofri's book and in some work I've done with Dr. Michael Boyce as well, the very first thing they need to do is actually greet the patient, look at them in the eye, and then sit down with them and look at them without a device in between them. Whether that device is a phone or a laptop or whatever the case is, because a lot of medicine today has electronic components in it. The second thing Dr. Ofri said and Dr. Boyce reinforced is look at the patient history before they come in, not while they're there. Don't be reading the patient history while they're in front of you. And what does this translate for managers in workplaces as an example is if an employee or a group is coming to you and they've sent you something in advance to read, then read it in advance. Show them that you're listening before you walk in the room. In the medical system, what is a really defining difference between good doctors and great doctors is making sure that you have a physical examination towards the end of the consultation rather than at the beginning, because you've had the opportunity to build rapport. The patient won't be as tense and will probably tell you more during the act of a physical examination than if you're just talking to them across the table. Mm. And then finally, with elderly patients, great doctors encourage them to bring their family or somebody else who can listen on their behalf. I spoke to the head of market research for Nike and Coca-Cola in Japan, but what I discovered in that interview was she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And as she explained to me, from the minute the doctor said the words breast cancer, all she could hear was the air conditioning system in the room. She didn't hear another word that came out of the doctor's mouth. But as she said, thankfully she brought her own husband along who could help listen on her behalf. In Canada, there's currently an experiment underway where the National Health System is funding a project to have professional listeners sit there and take notes with patients while they talk to doctors so that they can review the notes afterwards. Because if you are being told about a life-threatening illness, the likelihood you're going to remember what the doctor says at that point in time is a 1 in 10 chance you'll remember what they've actually said. Because the parts of your brain that flood the system with cortisol or the fear response also blocks out the ability to remember and listen. So making sure that the patient's comfortable when those kind of diagnoses are given out is quite critical. Ironically, the opposite is true. The best listeners in the medical profession are nurses because they can take the time to build rapport. They can create a sense of history that's shared between the patient and the nurse isn't always seen as the expert. The nurse is seen as a guide through the journey in the hospital, for example, or the treatment, but not necessarily an expert. So the most that doctors can learn about listening is actually from their nurses.
You say nurses can take the time, and that brings up an interesting point, because when I talk to people about listening, they sometimes say, like, I'm too busy to listen and I'm under too much time pressure. And when I lead the conversation, I, get to the core much quicker. What would you say to those people?
I would say you get to your core much quicker, but rarely do you get to the core of what's important to the other person or what's important between the other person and yourself. In a rush to get to the outcome, you often don't take the time to explore fully all the options. In a rush to get there and listen quickly, you touch only on superficial options, possibly one or two. People who listen deeply, people who listen to what's unsaid, tend to look through up to 10 times more options than people who are just listening to respond. Also in those options, because they're generating more options, they're more likely to have options that are bought in by the other people and more likely to be implemented. So there's a beautiful African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go a long way, go together. And the same is true for listening. It's not enough to have buy-in to the idea. You need to have buy-in to get the idea implemented. And it's only when you show you're listening to the other that you'll generate buy-in to not only have your idea heard, but to have them want to implement that as well. So speed is great, but it comes at a cost. And generally the cost is options not explored or options not explained.
If you talk to executives in your coaching program, what do you tell them to make the switch to listen instead of rushing through the conversation?
There's a couple of simple prescriptions. The first one is you may not solve it in that first meeting. Be open to the fact that it may be unresolved. And number two, generate questions rather than answers for those you're working with, and not questions about what you're discussing. Sometimes the most powerful questions are what I call how-based questions. An example of a how-based question is, how long have you been thinking about this? And just asking that very simple question, it doesn't matter what topic they're talking about, you'll quickly understand. They've been thinking about it for 4 months, spoken to 55 other people, and got a wide range of views. That's a very different answer to, I've been thinking about it for about a week and a half. I've spoken to one other person. The next set of questions that you ask for the person who's been thinking about it for 5 months and well socialized is, so what would you do next? In a lot of cases, they know their answer, but they just need somebody else to give them permission. In the case that they've only been thinking about it for 5 weeks, a simple question that's a how-based question, meaning how would you socialize this idea, is who else do you need to talk to about this? What other perspectives do you need to consider? So for a lot of leaders, they've reached the pinnacle of their roles because they're technical experts and they've become excellent at answering technical questions.
Mm-hmm.
But if they want to not be working enormous number of hours and spending a lot of their home time doing work to catch up on the rest of the day, they have to become experts in helping other people learn how to think and learn how to think in a way that's aligned to the organization, but also to the system that they're part of. So the first thing I teach those leaders is, number one, be comfortable with asking questions. Number two, be comfortable saying you don't know. And finally, be comfortable with silence. Silence quite often is a great tool to help the other person just think a little bit more deeply. And when they do, you'll hear them use phrases like this. What I really mean is, what's really important on this project is, what matters right now to me, what we should be really discussing right now. These phrases are code words that the other person has started to think beyond the obvious answers, and that's the real conversation. And when that moment happens, people call it a light bulb moment, people call it an aha moment, people call it the moment of insight. I can remember it was probably 2.5 years ago. It was around Easter time, and I had a client ring me up in a big insurance company, very rational role, a chief actuary. And he said, I got it. I got them to say those magic words. And I said, oh, what magic words were they? They said, what's really important right now is this. And he said, I spent nearly 6 years studying to become an actuary and a chief financial officer. But the proudest moment of my career right now is what they said when I asked them that question, because I realized they'd thought about it more than I had. But more importantly, they'd come up with their own answer as well. And I said, oh, well, that's good to know. And he said, the other thing I've noticed is in asking these questions, people know the kinds of questions I'm going to ask, and they're asking them before they come and see me, and time is freed up in my calendar. I can actually see the end of the day rather than worrying about the day just becomes an endless day that goes into the next one. So for these leaders, silence, questions about how, and just making sure that person's fully explored their thinking is the simple things that people can do at this level.
What's being uncovered there, that's the unsaid, right? And I'm wondering, a lot of things are unsaid because it's, well, irrelevant. And of course you could say like irrelevant to whom, but is there times to stop listening? Is there a time to stop listening and move on?
Yeah. When listening feels exhausting, when listening feels repetitious, when options are completely exhausted and the group isn't generating new ones, that's when we move from hearing to acting, which is the second part of listening. Because listening doesn't take place unless something changes through an action. So for a lot of people, a simple question you could ask 2/3 of the way before the conclusion of a meeting: in the time remaining, what's the most productive thing we can do? In the time we've got left, what's the number one thing we can do that's going to make an impact for our customers? In the time remaining, if we were to come back in a year's time, what will be the one thing we really should be doing? So creating these multiple perspectives to get them from the hearing into the acting part of listening is quite critical. And there are many times where listening too much is counterproductive. And we see this in modern politics that's driven by market research and focus groups, where leaders listen to the focus group, they play back to the constituents what they heard, but they don't do anything about it. And it creates this loop that's unproductive, which is people saying the same thing over and over again, but not getting action from political leaders. And that kind of lack of leadership or inertia creates some of the environment in which we find what's happening in the UK, in the USA, and even in Western Europe right now, where there's frustration with political leaders not listening because all they're doing is trying to play back what the focus groups are saying back to the constituents. So you're right, Marcel, there is a point at which enough is enough with the listening. We now need to be acting.
You mentioned a couple of great examples of, well, great listeners, like Dr. King, for example. And it starts with awareness. It starts with being aware of the power of listening. If we go back to you, how did you become aware of the importance of listening?
I get asked this question a lot, and the thing that's consistent for me is there's never been one point at which I realized listening was important. But what I have realized over time, whether it was growing up in a school with 23 nationalities and I was used as the person who would do the translating between the sporty people and the academics, between the new migrants and the Australians, or the teachers and the students, it was because I could listen, in that case, beyond the words. Whether it was in my workplace, whether it was listening to graduates or graduates who left Microsoft were listening in the contact center when I was at Vodafone, where that's all we did. We sold the ability to listen to other people, but rarely did we listen to our own customers. We listened to market research, but we rarely put on a set of headphones and went into the contact center and listened to what the customers had to say. And it was all those things coming together where a good mentor of mine said to me about 4 years ago, if you could teach the world how to listen, that would be an important gift. If you could deconstruct how you listen, that would be enormous for the rest of the world, because surely we're in a time where listening is going to be valued more than speaking. And that's how this journey started, Marcel. It was about somebody asking me, can you explain how to listen? And I always start my speeches or training courses with, ironically, today I'm here to speak to you about listening. So looking backwards, it's obvious that listening was part of my life all the way along, but there was no flash of inspiration or lightning bolt moment where I just went, okay, now's my time to be in the world to teach people how to listen.
How did you learn how to listen?
So I think early on it's about observation. I would watch how my mum and my dad might listen differently. They argued a lot, so they probably struggled with how to listen. I say they argued a lot, but I have no point of reference to know if they argued more or less than any other mother and father, because I didn't live in anybody else's house. And I think I've always been really, really curious, not only to what people say, but what I say is the energy that comes back from them when they're talking. Because I think I can spot somebody who's not telling the truth pretty easily. There are things in their language, not just their body language, but the way they construct words, that always, it wasn't a rational thing. It was always something in my gut and my heart that just went, that's just not right. There were teachers at school that I would listen to and go, wow, they've got vast experience in this area. And then teachers where I'd go, wow, they literally must have just made that up about a minute beforehand. And I don't think it was till I started trusting myself to go, it's okay to trust your gut and your feeling rather than just trying to be rational in your head. And then about 6 years ago, my managing director encouraged me to explore what she said was, have you ever considered becoming a business coach? And I said, I have no idea what is a business coach. And she kind of explained, and I said, oh, wow, people get paid to do that. And she says, oh, yeah, they get paid to do that. Maybe you should go and search on the courses, and away I went. It was on my first coaching course where the second morning of the training course was dedicated completely to how to listen, that I went, oh my goodness, somebody's taken the time to write down how to listen. And all I realized then is that coaching as a profession is your ability to listen and reflect back and create different perspectives for the other person. So it taught me about how you can't listen to somebody else if you've got a story playing in your own head. You need to listen to yourself before you listen to somebody else. You can't walk from one meeting to the next and not have processed that and still be in a dialogue with yourself. You have to be able to be present for that person that you're speaking to. So the first insight for me, and I think something I'm really good at, is being focused, disciplined, and maintaining concentration, and being connected with my breathing. That's where I learned the deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. So for me, that became a powerful foundational skill from that point on.
But if you look at your background, Oscar, you spent 30 years or so in corporate roles. You probably were quite busy in these days and times. Like, were you always a good listener back then in that context?
Yeah, it's funny because many people now go, that's so obvious what you're doing now, Oscar. You always never had a problem setting aside time to listen to people. You always listened to people who wanted to join your team. That was one of the things I never understood, that I never had problem recruiting people to my team. I'd literally have people lining up to want to join my team. See, there's some global research by an organization called Gallup. It's a market research company. It's the largest in the world, and it runs this annual survey, and it says 85% of people in the workplace are either actively disengaged or disengaged in their work. That means they're just going through the motions. And the other thing that research says is that people don't leave their companies, they leave their managers. And the number one reason why people leave their managers is because they're not listened to. And I only discovered this after I started on this journey. So if I look back, and I would make sure that my meetings with my employees, my one-on-ones were kind of sacred. I didn't miss them. If somebody wanted to talk to me, I would make the time. I said, look, I can't always be available in the moment, but I'll definitely get back to you within 24 hours. So unconsciously, I think I was doing a lot of the things that we were talking about. Unconsciously, also, I realized there were times where I was an atrocious listener, particularly when it came to dealing with the global head office, when it came to dealing with the regional head office, when I was representing the voice of my employees and the customer and I didn't feel like they were hearing me. I got very frustrated. And in hindsight, rather than being curious like Dr. King would have been and understanding what my frustration was about, I would actively shut down from the conversation because I felt that for the third time saying the same thing 3 different ways, they obviously weren't hearing what I was saying. And looking back at it now, it's probably half me and half them. Half me meaning maybe I should have looked at 3 or 4 other ways of saying the same thing, and half them because I think they were listening very transactionally. They were ticking the box on the agenda item. They were listening for hearing. They were listening for responding, but they weren't listening for acting. So I think when I got internal and in the bigger parts, the global and regional head offices, I struggled to listen to them there. Whenever I was listening to an employee, customer, a coworker in Australia, that seemed to be my natural way of being. Listening was natural and easy then.
But it takes 2 to tango, and if you have another party that you're talking to and you find it hard to listen to them, what would you do differently today, knowing what you know now about listening?
Oh, look, this happens to me on a daily basis. Quite often, people will talk in some jargon and some language that's very specific to their industry. And in the past, what I would do is I would just let them finish and then ask a completely different question to kind of move the topic on. Whereas now, if somebody is explaining a very complex issue to me, and a lot of the issues that my clients deal with are complex, and one of the things they always say to me is for me to help them to distill it down. So one of the techniques I steal is Bronwyn King's technique. Hey, my 5-year-old is called Ruby. If she was in the room right now, how would we explain this to Ruby? If a customer was in the room right now and we had to use really simple language for the customer, what would you say? So in the past, I would have just gone through, pretended like I understood what they said. But in the process of me being humble enough to go, I don't understand. Equally, you don't understand that well enough. Einstein always says It's easy to explain something that's complex, but the real skill is to be able to explain it simply. And helping them to simplify what they're trying to say helps their thinking get to a level of insight that they don't have before. Because a lot of the time I'll say, if we were up in front of all of the staff in an all hands or a town hall meeting, how would you explain that to them right now? Because I'm sure you wouldn't use this language. And then finally, if I get really stuck and they really haven't got a breakthrough or anything like that, I always say, look, what's your favorite drink? And so if I imagine they say a whiskey, I say, great. Imagine we've had 3 whiskeys. It's 11 o'clock at night. Explain it to me now. And in that moment, you can see this big smile on their face, and they go, well, it's like this, and they'll literally say it in 5 words. And I say, great. And a great employee of mine, Steve, taught me this technique. If you can't say it in pub talk, don't say it. Because if you can say it like you're in a pub or in a bar or in a restaurant or at a dinner party, that it's so simple that you've had a couple of wines or drinks and you're relaxed, say it like that. And that's how I listen differently now to help the speaker to say what they need to say in a way that's not only useful for me, but also useful for them, because they'll have to take that out of the room when I'm working with them into their organisation or their customers or the companies they're acquiring or whatever the case may be, or talking to government regulators or ministers of their particular industry or things like that.
You say you are humble enough to ask these simple questions, vulnerable enough, I think, to admit, like, I don't know this, can you explain it to me? Not sure where I'm going with this, but is that what you are saying?
Yeah, a lot of cases, and we kind of go back, Marcel, to this loop around the expert in the room. The expert in the room is only useful if that expert can explain it to non-experts. So it's one thing to be able to explain it to your peers in very complex, nuanced language. But for a lot of leaders, they spend all their life explaining ingredients, occasionally recipes and rarely menus. For a lot of the leaders I work with, they talk like this. Chop up onions, saute them in butter and garlic, add some tomato paste, some salt and some pepper. Now, right now, everybody in the audience has got a completely different dish in mind. Some people are thinking spaghetti sauce. Some people are thinking lasagna sauce. Some people are thinking sauce for nachos. Some people are thinking shepherd pie. The reason I know all these ranges is because it's a training exercise I use. And yet most leaders talk like this. They talk about all the ingredients, and the ingredients are so interchangeable that they don't make sense. They talk about systems and processes and platforms and all this language that is completely interchangeable, as opposed to saying, we're all sitting down at the family dinner table, and in the oven is some garlic bread and some lasagna. And I've just opened the oven door and the smell comes across the room. The smell of the Parmesan cheese is amazing because it's so fresh. And you can smell the herbs coming out of the garlic bread. And everybody's got a glass of wine and they're ready to eat. Now, I guarantee you, everybody listening to this podcast right now, their mouth is salivating. Is it happening for you?
Yeah, but it's morning here, so I'm thinking more about breakfast dishes, but I get what you're saying.
So if we explain and communicate in the menu first, then we can talk about the recipe, and then we can talk about the ingredients. But too many leaders speak in this very complex ingredients-orientated language, and the only time you're going to help people to make the change is when you move them emotionally. And when you know you've done that, is simple things like if your mouth is salivating, you know you've helped them to connect emotionally with food. Now, when I talked about onions and garlic and butter and saute and mincemeat and tomato paste, nobody's mouth was salivating. They're all brains trying to figure out what am I making. And that's what happens to leaders when they communicate poorly. They talk about the ingredients. They don't explain the context. They need to start at the menu and work their way down. So that way, you can help a speaker with the way they'll be heard rather than misheard. You help the speaker understand how they can be listened to and acted on rather than walking out with a group that's confused and uncertain of what their future is. You know, one of the things I did in my time at Microsoft was the part of Microsoft era that I was in was the part of Microsoft era where everybody laughed at the iPhone. And everybody said, it's a really, who's going to pay $1,000 for a phone? It's got none of this and it's got none of that. And wind the clock forward 10 years, you know, there's been 6 billion iPhones sold in that time period, and Microsoft completely missed the market because they weren't listening to their customers. You know, Microsoft had a very myopic view of what was possible with computing, and as a result of not listening to what their customers wanted, they missed a whole market opportunity. So, you know, systems that don't listen do so with a huge cost as a result.
If we go back to the individual, coaching executives, for example, how do you take them from being an unconscious listener to being a deep listener?
I think the big thing I want to take them from and to is just be aware of the difference between a good listener and a great listener is not that they are distracted, because that's really the difference between a good and a great listener. A good listener will be distracted and just meander through a conversation. A great listener knows they're distracted and very quickly gets back into the dialogue. The difference between being an unconscious listener and a deep listener is knowing the 125-400 rule that says you speak at 125 words a minute and you can listen at 400. That's why if you're really good, you should be listening to this podcast at 2 times speed, because you'll still be able to comprehend me. But you can't do that in the workplace. You can't speed up the way people speak. So what do you do when you drift off? For a lot of people, they don't even realize they're drifting off and they have to come back in the conversation. So to become a listener that pays attention not only to the 125 words that are spoken, you need to pay attention to the patterns in the language. Do they talk in positives or negatives? Do they talk in individuals or groups? Do they talk about the past or the future? So starting to become conscious of these dimensions of listening will take you through to about 200 to 250 words in the dialogue. So you'll be able to stay in the dialogue because you're listening to it beyond the words. You're listening to some of the complexity in the way people are constructing their context. So one thing everybody can go and practice with tomorrow, the next time they have a conversation with someone after listening to this podcast, is just start to listen. Do people talk really sequentially? You know, do they talk about things that are lined up one after the other, or do they talk about it in random and seemingly disconnected ways? Do they talk in pictures and stories, or do they talk in numbers and models? And do they talk about facts and figures, or they talk about feelings? Because this gives you an insight in how you'll be able to listen to them differently. So it's one thing to say, tell me more about that. It's another thing to say, tell me more about how you feel about that, because they like to experience the world through feelings. I was talking to somebody, when was I talking to her? 6 weeks ago. And in this dialogue in the workplace, she was explaining to me she felt this way and she felt this way and she felt this way, but she was trying to make a rational decision. And one of the things I asked her to reflect on was a really simple question that I teach executives. Have you noticed any patterns in how you talk about this? And she described one pattern and then another and then another. And then finally she said, I've been talking about my feelings a lot at the moment, haven't I? And I said, so what would your feelings say to you right now?
Mm-hmm.
And she said, well, my feelings would say make a decision. And how would you make a decision? And she started to go back into this rational kind of MBA talk.
Yeah.
She was talking like synergizing and alignment and all of this. And I said, well, what does your gut say right now? Well, what does your heart say right now? What do you feel about this right now? She says, I've just got to do it. That's what I feel I've got to do.
Mm.
And I don't think if I was listening just to her words, but the fact that she used words like feel regularly, she would have been able to make that breakthrough. So for a lot of you in the audience right now, you're saying, wow, that's a whole different level of listening. It certainly is. And it's mentally really taxing to listen through all those dimensions. But like anything, it takes a bit of time, takes a bit of practice, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. So for you who's listening right now, just notice in the next conversation, does the person speak in pictures and stories and feelings, or do they talk in facts and figures and rationally and sequentially? That basically describes the theory of the left side and the right side of the brain. Just start to listen at that level and you'll open up a whole new world of impact, not only for you, but more importantly for the person speaking.
When I talk to people about listening, a lot of them struggle with getting into the right state of mind to listen, being calm and being in the moment and focused. Do you have a tip for these people on how to get there?
I think calm and focused and slow and in the moment is an ideal state. But life doesn't happen like that.
No.
So the first thing I would say to do if you're listening, listen at a point where you're matching who you're speaking to. I was talking to a suicide counselor who often get people talking on the phone who are coming on really fast and they're going to make some really big decisions about the rest of their life. And if they had to come on the phone and say to them, oh, okay, just slow down now, they would lose them. They know they do because they measure all these things. So what they do is they match the way they speak and they ask them if they're okay, and they slowly bring the speech down to a level that's productive, a level that's got some pause in it, a level that enables them to breathe deeply. But you're right, Marcel, it's all in the preparation. If you've got an ideal set of circumstances, what I work with my clients on doing, if you're going to visit a client, I say from the time you walk into the lobby to the time you get to reception, just breathe a little bit more deeply and notice your breathing and set an intention for the meeting you're going to have. Or if you're going from meeting room to meeting room, in that moment, rather than checking your phone, to get some email that you could have waited for another hour or even a week, that you didn't have to look at because you'll want it to get some dopamine hit so you could get the little red ball off your phone or your laptop. Again, just breathe and set an intention. You would never go to a concert and have your iPhone headset playing while the concert's going on. But all of us literally do that when we bring stories and music into our head to the next conversation. So just the practice of breathing will help you. The other one is a hydrated brain is a listening brain. So please bring water to a meeting. Please drink water during a meeting because listening is a significant cognitive load that you're not used to. Your brain works really hard when you listen at all those levels I talked about. But you need to get blood sugars to the brain, and the best way to do that is make sure your body's lubricated and make sure you're drinking. So most people, coffee's a great start to their day. Congratulations. I would never stop anybody from drinking coffee. But please, for the rest of the day, make sure you drink 2 liters of water as well. And that will help you think a little bit more clearly. So breathe deeply, drink water. These are the 2 key ingredients that are physical elements of listening. And the last one is just be comfortable with silence.
Mm-hmm.
When they take the breath in, just if they don't say anything, that's okay. 5 seconds of silence feels like 5 minutes. But for both of you, it gives you an opportunity for your mind to catch up, for other people in the meeting to catch up as well.
You pause a lot when you speak. Is that also because of that reason?
Yeah. I'm glad you noticed. And I have to actually say to people who interview me, please bear with me, because I'm going to take some time to think about the response I'm providing to you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also giving the audience a chance to collect their thoughts. So for those of you who are listening, depending on how Marcel edits this, you'll either hear the pauses or not. And I did a podcast 2 months ago with someone in the US, and I explained to him that I would be pausing, and he would probably notice that. And must have been 10 minutes into the interview, he spoke into the recording and said to the editor, "Oh, this guy's got so many pauses, you're really going to have to tighten that up." And then by the 45-minute mark, where he realized what I was doing was deliberate state management for you listening as well as for him, he realized that my pause was also helping him to think. And then he announced to the editor on the recording, "Please ignore my edit note at the 10-minute mark. We need to keep the pauses in. I just need to explain them because they've been so powerful for me." And again, for a lot of the face-to-face clients I work with and a lot of the Skype clients I work with, some of the things they say is just the space you can create by being okay with silence has a really transformational effect because it's rare at the moment. We fill our lives within an inch of a second, and the thing we crave the most is probably a pause. It's probably silence. It's probably the opportunity to reflect. And that's why you see all these various movements where there are meditation apps now that are being created because people are craving the opportunity just to pause and collect their thoughts. So the pause is really deliberate. It's really hard to do this when you get paid to speak, though, from a stage and you're in front of 1,000 people. And I remember 2.5 years ago, I was presenting at an event and I was asked to be the first speaker, but not the keynote speaker.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to the organizer, "Oh, I'm curious, how do you want to use me?" And they said, "Oh, we saw you speak at that other event," and it was about 6 months before. And they said, "What you did was change the way the room not only listened to you, listened to themselves, but listened to each other. What I want you to do is just speak for 8 minutes at the beginning of this conference." I think it was about 1,000 people. "And I just want you to do what you did to that room so they listen to every other speaker and themselves from now on, because you're my insurance policy to make sure they get lots of value out of the rest of the speakers who come on after the program. But more importantly, they're going to listen to each other in the break." And I went, "Oh, okay." So I went on stage, and a person who was in the audience came up to me at the break and said, "Hi, I've developed an app called Buddhify, which is a meditation app. Can you teach me to do what you're doing as my keynote speech? Because I'm just getting up and speaking. You actually took the group through a guided meditation." I said, "Well, it wasn't my intention, but if you feel that's what I did, that's great," because that was his language.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Did you notice nobody was looking at their phones while you were speaking?" And I said, "No, to be honest, I was too nervous to notice that people weren't looking at their phones." He said, "The minute you came off stage, everybody picked up their phones and started playing with them again. But while you were talking, very slowly, very patiently, very deliberately, you created a rhythm that took the group slowly down to a place. You held them there, and then you brought them back up ever so slowly." Now, I think that's because that was his expertise. I had no consciousness that I was doing that. But many people have commented that I speak slowly and deliberately, and that when they walk away from a conversation with me, they feel heard, but they also feel like it's been refreshing and different, because they say it's rare for people to hear them and listen to them. So a lot of people feel they're heard, but very few people feel they're listened to. So I think it's a really subconscious thing, Marcel. I think in probably 3 to 5 years, somebody will say to me, "You need to decode that, and you need to write about that, and you need to put that into some kind of structure so people understand that." But as I said at the beginning, the ancients know this already. Ancient wisdom has been doing this for a long time. So whether it's the Inuit of North America, the Indians of the American plains, the people in China, the people who are Aborigines or Maoris, or people from the Muslim countries, and all those things, they all teach how to breathe. They all teach how to hydrate. They all teach how to be patient. So I don't think anything I'm saying is new. I just think maybe the world's in a place where it's ready to hear it.
And if you talk about nerves, and I think that's one of the biggest enemies of good listening, because you cannot be calm. If you think about your next meeting, maybe today, or, well, it's evening there, but maybe tomorrow or the course of the week.
I can think of the meeting last week, in fact. It's quite possibly going to become my biggest client in the whole of the Asia Pacific region. And this is a brand everybody uses every day. And I was so excited that they would take a call from me, and 2 people had referred me to them because they'd heard my podcasts on listening, and I was completely petrified going on to that call. I had 30 minutes. They wanted me to speak at their conference, and all was going through my head was, I'm not worthy. I'm not good enough. They have much more polished professional speakers. What are they gonna? I can't keep it together. And then I just followed my own practice. I took a glass of water, as I have now, to the call. It was a call to Singapore and to Korea and to Australia. And I practiced the breathing, and then I realized that the call is not about me. In fact, it's not even about them. I reminded myself, okay, Oscar, the most important question you need to ask is, what do you want to have different for the audience once I've finished speaking? Because it's not about me or that brand. It's actually about the audience. And as soon as I said, that's the question, I went, right, I'm in the right headspace now, because it's not about me. My attention is not on me. My attention is on those that we want to help, we want to serve. It's the audience. And it was really interesting because that wasn't the question they were expecting from me. In fact, they weren't even expecting a question from me. They were expecting an explanation of the ingredients in my dish. That was my speech. Because I said, look, before we get started, I'm really curious. Who's in the audience? What do you want them to feel, think, and do differently as a result of this presentation? Mm-hmm. And I knew it was a question they hadn't anticipated, because you could hear this long pause, and there was like, who's going to take that kind of scenario? And you always know it's a good question, because if it generates some silence, it's when they can answer really quickly that it's a shallow question. And they said, you must have been in our last meeting, because we can't quite agree on what we want different for the audience. And I simply explained to them that, just paint a picture for me right now. Who is the one person in the audience that you want to reach? And then they explained that it was this person. Was a woman, was about 34 years old. She was a middle manager inside an organization. I said, great, let's give her a name. And we gave her a name. And they went, oh, well. And they said, we want them to do these 3 things. And if you can describe the problem better than they can, they often think you have the solution. So real time, I'm going, now my talk is slightly different from what I imagined. And it all happened in about 10 minutes in a 30-minute phone call. Mm-hmm. And on, where are we at today? It's Monday. I got an email at about 3 o'clock this afternoon saying, we'd love you to come and speak at our event. And I pick up the phone to thank the person for it. And I said, I'm curious if you were looking at anybody else. And they said, yeah, we actually spoke to 3 people. But you're the only person who asked us about the audience. Everybody else was talking about their fee and their transport and limousines and AV requirements. And I said, okay. Well, it was a good lesson for me, because I was completely freaked out, Marcel, going into that call. It's a brand everybody would know. In fact, half your audience would be using that brand's device to listen to this podcast.
I have an idea what it is now.
So, for me, reminding myself of my own principles, the trouble with being, as my wife says, completely obsessed about listening, is you have to role model good listening all the time. And it's easy to know when you're not, because people point it out to you really quickly. So for me, when I'm freaked out and when I've got this internal dialogue going on, whether it's from my stomach or my head, whether my heart's pounding, whether the birds in my stomach are flying around, I always go back to, have I had enough to drink? Water. Am I breathing properly? Yes. And is this about me or them, or is it about the people we're looking to help in common? So in that case, it might be the audience or the customer or the reseller or whoever that might be. But they're the 3 things that keep me on track. And I know the sales I've lost because I was all about me. And the opposite is true too. In early days, leaving corporate life and thinking I knew everything, I didn't ask questions. I explained to people that, I was a former marketing director at Microsoft and had a 30-year career across multinationals and technology and telecommunications and professional services firms. And as far as I knew, I could help them with anything. But what I realized is that I had to narrow down really narrowly what I knew and just focus on that, because when I do it really, really well. And now I have to teach it. And my goal is to teach 100 million deep listeners in the world by 2030. And today's podcast is one step in that journey.
100 million?
100 million. There's a story behind this, as there usually is. When I sat down with that mentor and he said to me, if you could train people on how to do this, you'd have an extraordinary impact in the world. It would be like dropping a pebble in a lake and all these concentric rings would move out and you'd have an impact all around the world and across many generations. He said, but I feel like I've freaked you out. So let's come back in a week and have a quick call and let's see if you're up for it. So I come from the world of smart goals and I couldn't make sense of that. So I went, well, if I could train 10 million listeners in the world, that would be a good thing. So I went back, spoke to Matt and said, okay, challenge accepted. I would 10 million listeners by 2030. So he said, do you think you can achieve that by 2030? I said, I can see how I can do it really, really easily. I said, you've got to understand, I've come from the software industry and I know really well how to scale ideas globally. He says, well, if you can achieve that in your lifetime, it's not a big enough goal. It's not ambitious enough. It's not worthy of you. How does 100 million sound? And I took a huge gulp and all those nerves came back. My blood drained from my face. My palms are sweating. My palms are sweating right now. And I wanted to say, I'll come back in a week. And I just said, because I went with my gut, I said, challenge accepted. It won't happen in my lifetime, but 100 million, I can definitely see how to do it with software, with mobile apps, with Alexas and Google Home devices, becoming listening coaches for people by getting listening into curriculum for university teachers and school teachers. I can see really, really, really clearly that that's very possible. If not in my lifetime, a generation after that. So call me crazy, but 100 million, it definitely is. It's only 2% of the world's population. So honestly, I should be setting a much bigger goal than that.
For those who can't get enough and want to, be among the 100 million deep listeners, what's the best way to learn more about you and your work?
Well, if you love to listen, it's simply oscartrimboli.com/podcasts, and you can plug in and listen to some amazing professional and personal listeners that I interview, whether that's suicide counselors, air traffic controllers, orchestra conductors, workplace mediators, high court judges, journalists. We've interviewed all sorts of fascinating listeners who can teach you all about the different 5 levels of listening. But I think the thing I take out of all of the interviews is what holds those people apart from any other listener is they are disciplined, they are focused, and they are humble. They all know that they're one conversation away from being a poor listener, and quite often these people will say, I'm sorry, I got a bit lost. Could you repeat that again? And it's probably one of the phrases I use more regularly than most people would anticipate, because it takes a great deal of humility to admit you got lost in a conversation. And sometimes I have to be honest and say, it's not like I'm asking them to explain it to Ruby, the 5-year-old. I just got completely lost because of the 125/400 rule. So all these amazing listeners from Israel, from the United Kingdom, from Europe, from South America, from Asia, from North America, from Africa, all these amazing listeners from different parts of the world and different age groups and different language backgrounds all provide a fantastic way to learn about how to listen.
Which I can highly recommend. Oscar, thanks so much for this conversation.
Hey, thanks, Marcel. I really appreciate you listening to me.
To learn more about this episode, check out the show notes on meetingstrategist.org, which is also where I'm posting my blogs and share tips and strategies to help you get more out of meetings. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving a quick review to help more people discover this show. Thanks for listening. Have a nice day.